The winter wind didn't care how hard he worked or how much the sheep trusted him. One by one, Elias Crowley found them frozen in the snow, quiet, helpless, forgotten by a world that never slowed down. People told him it was normal, that some lives were simply meant to be lost. But standing alone on the frozen plains, this cowboy made a promise the wind wasn't supposed to hear. What happens next will make you believe in quiet miracles and second chances for the forgotten. Before we begin, tell me where you are watching from. Drop your country in the comments below, and if you believe no child or animal should ever face fear alone, hit subscribe now and share this story with someone who needs hope. Red Mesa, New Mexico, in the winter of 1902, looked like a land that had forgotten kindness. The town sat low in a shallow basin of red earth and brittle sage, pinned beneath a sky the color of dull tin. Wind came down off the distant mesas and moved through the streets like an uninvited judge, lifting grit from the road and worrying it against windows, fences, and the edges of a man's patience. On the coldest mornings, the air tasted faintly of iron and wood smoke. Even the church bell sounded thinner, as if the metal had shrunk from the weather. Elias Crowley lived a mile outside town, where the land opened into scrub and pasture. At 34, he carried himself like someone who had learned early that the world did not pause for grief. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and built the way fence posts were built, straight, weathered, useful. His hair was dark brown with a stubborn wave that never quite obeyed a comb, and his face had sharp planes at the cheekbones and jaw, the kind that caught light at sunset and looked carved in shadow at dawn. He kept a short beard most winters, not out of style, but because shaving in a drafty washroom felt like starting a fight with a knife. Elias didn't speak much, not because he was unfriendly, but because he measured words the way he measured feed, only what was needed, given at the right time. Folks in town said he was steady, which was a polite way of saying he was hard to rattle and harder to read. He'd inherited the small spread the year before, after his mother's passing. The house was simple. 2 rooms and a lean-to kitchen, boards bleached by sun, roof patched with tar paper. The barn was older than the house and leaned a little to the east, as if it had spent a lifetime bracing against prevailing winds. Elias had repaired what he could, replaced a hinge, hammered down loose shingles, stacked split mesquite for the stove. He'd told himself more than once that repairs were a kind of prayer. Not a fancy one, but honest. The flock was modest, just over 50 sheep, a mix of ewes and a few rams, their wool thickening as the season sharpened. Sheep were not like horses. They didn't meet a man's eyes as if they were weighing his soul. Sheep were simpler, and in that simplicity, more helpless. They trusted patterns. They trusted the sound of a bucket. They trusted the shape of the fence line. They trusted that the world would remain mostly the same from one day to the next. Elias respected that kind of faith the way he respected a child's trust. He did not want to be the reason it broke. On the morning the story truly began, the storm had already spent itself. It left behind a silence so complete it seemed to press down on the land. Snow lay thin but stubborn across the pasture, gathered in shallow drifts against fence posts in the barn's north wall. The sun was up, but it gave no warmth, only a pale light that made the world look clean and dangerous. Elias stepped out, with a bucket of grain in one hand and a coil of rope in the other. His boots squeaked in the crusted snow. He paused on the porch for half a heartbeat, listening. Wind had eased overnight, but it still prowled along the edges of things. A man could feel it in the way his ears went numb too fast. Behind him, Bram padded out into the yard. Bram was a sheepdog in the way old men were veterans, quiet about it, but made of habit and history. He was 8 years old, gray around the muzzle, with a brindled coat that looked like someone had brushed ash and honey through black fur. One ear folded at the tip from an old injury, and his eyes were amber and watchful, the kind that could be soft one second and razor clear the next. Bram didn't bark unless it mattered. He didn't waste energy on nonsense. He followed Elias at a respectful distance, as if he was always giving the man room to make decisions and ready to correct those decisions if they were foolish. Elias trusted that dog more than he trusted most men, and Bram, in return, trusted Elias with the same calm certainty he gave the flock. When Elias reached the pasture gate, he found the sheep already clustered near the barn side, heads down, shifting on stiff legs. They looked up at the bucket and moved in a slow, shuffling wave. Elias counted them without thinking. He did it the way some men breathed. 1, 2, 3. The numbers came out wrong. He stopped pouring grain. Bram stopped too, posture tightening, head angled toward the far side of the pasture where the snow looked smoother, less disturbed. Elias scanned the fence line, then the shallow dip beyond the barn where the land fell away toward a dry wash. A cold feeling settled behind his ribs, not panic, not yet, but the first hint of something gone missing. He set the bucket down and walked. The snow out there was unbroken until he neared the wash. Then he saw a trail, small, uneven hoofprints, scattered like a sentence written by a shaky hand. The tracks veered away from the flock's usual path, heading toward the low spot where wind often pooled and turned cruel. Elias followed them, rope looped over his forearm. Bram moved ahead, nose close to the ground, tail low and still. 50 yards from the barn, Elias found her. She lay on her side with her legs tucked awkwardly as if she'd tried to curl into herself for warmth and failed halfway through. Ice crystals clung to her wool, turning it into something glittering and wrong. Her breath was gone. Her eyes were half-lidded, lashes dusted with frost. Around her, the snow was lightly dimpled where she'd struggled for a place that didn't exist. Maribel. She wasn't the prettiest ewe he owned, no prize ribbon animal with perfectly even fleece, but she had a gentle nature and a steady gait. She'd been born during a spring rain, and Elias had dried her with his own coat, hands clumsy and careful. She'd learned his shape, his smell, his voice. When he whistled, she came, not fast, but faithfully, as if the sound meant safety was nearby. Now safety stood over her with boots and a rope and nothing useful to do, as Elias didn't move for a long moment. The cold kept his face still, but inside him, something buckled. He knelt beside Maribel and placed a gloved hand on her wool. It felt hard, packed with frost. There was no warmth left to find, no heartbeat to argue with fate. The wind stirred faintly and slid across the wash like a ghost passing through a doorway. Bram sat down a few feet away and looked at Elias, not with pity. Dogs don't indulge much in pity, but with a sober, steady attention, like a witness sworn to tell the truth. Elias swallowed. The sound was loud in the empty morning. He thought of his mother then, the way grief brings the dead in without knocking. Ruth Crowley had been a small woman with sun-browned skin and hands that never stopped working, even when she sat. Her hair had been the color of wheat in late summer, usually braided down her back, the braid thick as a rope. Her eyes were a pale hazel that crinkled when she smiled, and she smiled more often than life had any right to allow. She'd had a practical kindness. She could scold a man and feed him in the same breath, and she'd believed that gentleness was not weakness, just a different kind of strength. When Elias was a boy, he'd once asked her why sheep followed so easily. Ruth had brushed his hair back from his forehead and said, "Because they don't know how to bargain with the world, Eli. They trust what's near. That means we don't get to be careless." Elias hadn't been careless on purpose. That was the cruel part. He'd shut the gate. He'd checked the latch. He'd watched the sky darken and heard the wind rise like a pack of wolves. He'd done what men always did, hoped the night would pass without taking payment. He stared at Maribel's still form and felt the old superstition rise in him, an urge to apologize to the earth, to bargain with something unseen. But there was nothing to bargain with. Winter didn't trade. Winter collected. His jaw tightened. A breath steamed out of him, thin and white. "I'm sorry, girl," he said, voice rough. He didn't talk to sheep often, not like he talked to Bram, but the words came anyway. "I'm sorry." Then, quieter, as if speaking to himself might make the promise stronger. "Not again." It was a foolish thing to promise the weather. The wind didn't care about vows. Snow didn't soften because a man regretted his mistakes. But a promise wasn't for the wind. A promise was for the living. Elias looped the rope around Maribel carefully, as if she could still feel rough handling. He pulled, slow and steady, dragging her back toward the barn. The rope cut a line through the thin snow like a scar being written. Bram walked alongside, occasionally glancing at the pasture, keeping an eye on the flock with that quiet competence that made Elias feel both grateful and slightly ashamed. The dog could only do so much. The rest was on the man. When Elias reached the barn, he opened the side stall where he kept a few tools and sacks of feed. He laid Maribel down on a bed of old straw, away from the worst of the wind that seeped through cracks in the boards. For a moment, he simply stood there, hands hanging at his sides, and looked at what winter had done. Outside, the sheep bleated, soft, questioning sounds. life asking for the next instruction. Elias stepped out again and found himself scanning the horizon as if he could spot danger moving toward him. The mesas in the distance sat indifferent under the pale sky. The wind shifted, tugging at his coat. He thought of all the nights ahead, all the storms yet to come, all the small panics that could scatter a flock into the dark. He pictured frozen bodies in snow, one after another, like accusations. Something in him hardened, not into cruelty, but into resolve. The kind of resolve that didn't need loud words or an audience. The kind that starts with a man standing in cold air, admitting he is not prepared, and deciding that this will change. Bram came to his side and pressed his shoulder lightly against Elias's leg, a brief touch that said, in the simplest language on earth, "Here, now, keep going." Elias rested a gloved hand on Bram's head. He looked down at the dog and almost smiled. Humor, even in grief, was a stubborn weed. "You and me," he murmured, half to Bram and half to the wind that would not listen. "We're going to figure this out." He turned back toward the flock, lifted the bucket again, and began to pour grain in a line that would keep them close. He counted once more, still wrong by one, and it would be wrong forever. But the counting wasn't just tallying loss, it was learning, it was noticing. It was the first step toward a different winter. The day moved on. The sun climbed and offered. Nothing. Smoke rose from chimneys in town. Somewhere a door creaked and shut. Red Mesa kept breathing, as it always did, in spite of what the weather demanded. Elias fed the flock, checked the latches twice, and stood for a long time at the barn door, watching the wind test every weakness it could find. In that watching, the seed of an idea began, small, not yet shaped into a plan, but alive. The question formed without words. If the wind was the killer, then what could stop it? Behind him, Bram lay down in the straw, eyes open, keeping watch like an old guardian in a quiet myth. Outside, the sheep huddled closer together, trusting the fence line, trusting the barn, trusting the man who had promised the impossible. And Elias Crowley, 34 years old in the bitter winter of 1902, let the weight of one lost ewe settle into him like a stone. Heavy, yes, but solid enough to build on. He didn't know the shape of the solution yet. He only knew that this was the beginning, and that he would not let winter write the ending the same way again. The days after Maribel's death settled into Red Mesa like a low fever. Nothing dramatic, nothing that announced itself, just a persistent unease that refused to lift. Winter did not retreat. It lingered, prowling the edges of the land, testing seams and patience with equal interest. The sky stayed hard and pale, and the wind learned the shape of Elias Crowley's property the way water learns a riverbed. It found every gap. It worried every corner. Elias worked harder than he ever had. He rose before first light, breath fogging the dark, and checked the flock with a lantern swinging from his hand. He reinforced the barn door with an extra plank, drove nails until his arms ached, and packed straw into cracks where the boards had shrunk apart over decades of heat and cold. He hauled more rations from town and stacked them neatly, careful to keep them dry. He told himself, more than once, that diligence could make up for loss. If winter was a ledger, he would balance it with effort. The barn looked sturdier by the week. Its roof no longer rattled as badly when gusts rolled down from the mesas. The hinges held, the latch bit cleanly. Inside, the air was warmer than the open pasture, and the smell of hay and animals was thick and familiar. Elias watched the sheep file in each evening and felt a measure of relief as the last one crossed the threshold. He counted them. He always counted them. The number stayed true, and that truth felt like a fragile blessing. But winter has a way of making a mockery of enclosed spaces. It does not always kill where a man expects it to. The first loss after Maribel did not happen in the night. It happened in the gray half-hour before dusk, when the wind came in sudden and sharp, like a slap. Elias was mending a fence near the south line when Bram stiffened beside him, ears lifting, body angling toward the open pasture. The sheep had been grazing close, their backs hunched against the cold, moving in a loose, obedient cluster. Then, the wind cut across the land at a new angle, skimming low and fast. The flock rippled. A few ewes broke left, heads up, legs churning with blind urgency. Elias shouted and ran. Bram surged forward, cutting the stragglers off with practiced efficiency, nipping the air near their heels without touching flesh. Most of the flock turned back, bunching toward the barn, but one ewe, young, skittish, new to the land, bolted toward the wash as if the earth itself had opened a door for her escape. By the time Elias reached the barn and slammed the gate behind the rest, the light was failing. He grabbed the lantern and followed the tracks again, heart pounding with a familiarity he despised. He found her near the same low place where Maribel had fallen, alive but shuddering, her legs already stiffening as the cold claimed ground. He wrapped his coat around her and carried her back, breath coming hard, muscles burning. She lived through the night, but she never truly recovered. 2 days. Later, she went down and did not rise. The barn had done nothing to save her. The fence had not held her fear. The wind had done its work in seconds, and Elias felt the same dull weight settle into him, less sharp than the first time, but heavier for being expected. By the end of that week, Winter took 2 more. One was an older ram with a scarred flank and a calm, stubborn nature. The other was a ewe heavy with lamb. Neither died inside the barn. Both died outside it, caught in moments when the wind turned and the flock fractured. The pattern was no longer subtle. Elias could see it as clearly as he could see his own hands in front of him. He stood in the barn one night after burying the last, lantern set on a hook, light trembling on the walls. Bram lay near the door, head on his paws, eyes open. The sheep were quiet, pressed together, their bodies creating a shared warmth that made the air breathe easier. Elias watched them and felt the uncomfortable truth rise up. The barn was not enough because it asked the sheep to behave like walls. It asked them to hold against fear, to remain orderly when the world was not. That truth followed him into town the next day. Red Mesa in winter was a place of narrow shoulders and braced expressions. Men walked with their coats pulled tight and their hats pulled low, faces set against the wind as if daring it to do its worst. Elias hitched his horse outside the general store and stepped in, boots thumping on the warped boards. The store smelled of coffee, leather, and cold iron. A few men stood near the stove, hands extended to the heat, their talk low and practical. Harlan Boone was among them. Boone was close to 60, tall in a way that had gone slightly bent with age, his shoulders still broad beneath a heavy coat. His beard was gray and worn thin at the edges, trimmed close to his jaw, and his mustache drooped over a mouth that had learned to frown before it smiled. His nose had been broken at least once, leaving it crooked and red in the cold. Folks said Boone had been a different man before his wife died, quicker to laugh, less inclined to judge. Afterward, something had closed in him. He valued order, routine, and the idea that the land demanded payment whether a man liked it or not. Boone glanced at Elias and nodded, a brief acknowledgement. "Heard you lost another," he said, not unkindly, but without ceremony. Elias nodded back. 2. Boone's mouth tightened. "Hard winter." "It's not the cold," Elias said before he could stop himself. The words surprised him as much as anyone. He realized in that moment that the thought had been forming quietly, assembling itself from observation rather than hope. Boone raised an eyebrow. "Cold's always the culprit." Elias shook his head. "They don't die when it's still. They die when the wind scatters them." There was a murmur near the stove. A man named Calder, thin with a nervous habit of rubbing, his hands together, snorted softly. Boone studied Elias for a long second, eyes narrowed not with anger but with skepticism. "Sheep have survived winters longer than you and me have been breathing," Boone said. "You keep them fed, you keep them penned, you accept losses. That's the trade." Elias felt heat rise in his chest, sharp and unwelcome. He kept his voice even. "Maybe we've been accepting what we don't have to." Boone's gaze hardened just a little. "Careful, Crowley. That kind of thinking makes a man miserable." Elias didn't argue. He bought his feed and left, the wind pushing at his back as if eager to escort him out. Bram waited patiently by the hitching post, tail giving a single thump when Elias appeared. The dog didn't care about tradition. He cared about outcomes. That afternoon, Elias rode the perimeter of his land, not mending this time, but watching. He stood on the low rise near the wash and let the wind hit him full on. It cut through his coat and found the warm places beneath, stealing heat with practiced ease. He imagined the same wind hitting wool, slipping through the fibers, confusing the flock with noise and pressure. He watched how snow drifted against obstacles, how it piled on the leeward side of fence posts and wagon remnants left to rot. He watched how the land itself shaped the wind, bending it, breaking it, softening it where it met resistance. Back at the barn, he tried an experiment born of impatience. He stacked spare boards along the north wall, creating a crude barrier inside the structure, a place where the sheep could huddle away from drafts. It helped a little. The air was calmer in that corner, warmer by a degree or two. But when a gust slammed into the barn from the west, the whole building shuddered, and the sheep shifted uneasily, eyes wide, bodies tensing. Elias knew then that patchwork fixes would not outrun a force that learned and adapted. The next loss came in early January, during a night that began deceptively calm. Elias had checked the weather before bed. No storm forecasted, no heavy snow. He slept lightly anyway, waking to the sound of wind rising fast like breath drawn for a shout. By the time he reached the barn, lantern swinging, the flock was already restless. He managed to get most of them inside, but the wind had found its moment. It screamed across the pasture, scattering snow and scents alike. 2 sheep broke away and did not return. Elias found them at dawn, not together, not near anything that could be called shelter. He buried them side by side and stood over the disturbed earth longer than was necessary. The promise he'd made beside Maribel pressed against him now, heavier for each failure. He didn't feel anger at the sheep. He felt anger at himself and at the habit of doing things because they had always been done that way. That evening, Boone rode out to Elias's place. His horse was a bay with a scarred knee, steady and unremarkable. Boone dismounted and stood near the fence, hands resting on the top rail, his posture weary. "I lost 3 last night," Boone said without preamble. "Found them strung out along the wash." Elias met his gaze. "I lost 2. Boone nodded once. "That's how it goes." Elias looked past him, toward the open land, the way the wind carved invisible paths across it. "Doesn't have to." Boone's mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "You still on about the wind?" "Yes." Boone studied Elias again, longer this time. The older man's eyes softened just a fraction, revealing something like fatigue beneath the steel. "You're thinking too much," he said, though there was less conviction in it now. "Thinking won't stop winter." "No," Elias agreed. "But building might." Boone snorted, more out of habit than disdain. "Build all you like. Winter collects anyway." He mounted and rode off, leaving Elias with the cold in his thoughts. Bram watched the horse go, then looked up at Elias as if waiting for instruction. Elias rested a hand on the dog's head, fingers sinking into thick fur, grounding him. The barn stood behind them, solid and insufficient. The pasture lay ahead, wide and unforgiving. Between the two, the wind roamed free, a thief unchallenged. Elias turned back toward the barn, not to patch or mend, but to sit and think. He sat on an overturned crate, lantern casting a small, steady circle of light. He replayed the losses in his mind, not as failures, but as lessons. Where they happened, when, under what conditions. Patterns emerged when he let himself see them without flinching. By the time the lantern burned low, Elias had not solved the problem, but he had named it. And naming, he knew, was the first honest act of change. Outside, the wind tested the night again. Inside, a man began to consider what it would take to make the wind work harder for its victories. By mid-January, Red Mesa had settled into the kind of cold that made men economical with movement and thought. The days were short and brittle, the light thin as a blade. Wind returned as if on a schedule only it understood, arriving at different hours from different directions, never long enough to be predicted and never brief enough to be ignored. Elias Crowley began to live by the wind's moods, not out of fear, but out of study. He rose earlier, stayed out later, and let the land teach him in the only language it used: pressure, sound, and consequence. He stopped patching the barn, not because it didn't need the work, but because he had learned the limits of repair. Instead, he started walking. He walked the pasture at dawn when the cold lay lowest and the ground sang beneath his boots. He walked again at noon when the sun made a weak attempt at mercy, and again at dusk when shadows pooled and the wind took liberties. Bram went with him each time, 8 years old and tireless in purpose if not in speed, moving ahead and then circling back, as if drawing an invisible map with his body. Elias carried a notebook now, small, bound in rough leather, the pages already warped from damp and cold. He made marks in it without ceremony, arrows for wind direction, numbers for time, brief phrases like scatter near wash, still air behind old wagon, drift builds fast on leeward side. He did not romanticize the process. This was not inspiration. It was accounting. On one of those walks near the south fence where a pair of abandoned freight wagons lay half buried in sand and snow, Elias noticed something that made him stop short. The wind struck the wagons hard, whistling through broken spokes and rattling iron rims, but behind them the ground was calm. Snow lay deeper there, soft and undisturbed, forming a shallow bowl. The air felt different, quieter, heavier, as if it had been asked to rest. Bram trotted into that pocket and turned in a small circle, then sat, tail thumping once. The dog looked at Elias with a familiar, knowing steadiness. This place, his posture said, was acceptable. Elias stood there for a long moment, letting the wind batter his back while the quiet held at his front. He raised a gloved hand and felt the difference. The land, it seemed, was willing to help if asked the right way. That evening, Elias rode into town again, not for supplies, but for conversation. He found the blacksmith shop open, the wide doors yawning to let smoke and sparks escape. Inside, Jonah Pike worked at the anvil with slow, deliberate strokes. Pike was a man in his late 40s with arms like fence rails and hands permanently darkened by soot. His beard was thick and black with a streak of silver running through it like a fault line, and his eyes were pale and attentive beneath heavy brows. He had a habit of listening longer than he spoke, a habit that came from years of shaping metal to a will that was not his own. Elias waited until Pike set the hammer down and wiped his hands. "Evening," Elias said. "Evening," Pike replied. "Wind's up." "Always is," Elias said. He hesitated, then added, "I've been watching it." Pike's mouth curved slightly. "That's so." Elias described what he'd seen by the wagons, the stillness behind obstacles, the way snow told the story of force and shelter better than words. Pike listened, leaning against the anvil, arms crossed, expression thoughtful. "Wind's like heat," Pike said finally. "You don't beat it by fighting. You redirect it, break it up." Elias nodded. "That's what I'm thinking." Pike studied him a moment longer. "You planning something foolish?" "Maybe," Elias said, "but less foolish than burying sheep." Pike snorted softly. "Can't argue with that." He glanced toward the open door where the wind worried the hanging chains. "If you're going to build against wind, don't build. Straight lines give it something to push on." That advice followed Elias home like a companion. Over the next days, Elias began to notice how fear moved through the flock as much as wind did. Sheep did not simply scatter at random. They followed pressure, noise, and the sudden absence of expected barriers. When the wind rose sharply from the west, they pressed east, away from the sound. When it swirled from the north, they bunched near the barn's south wall. Bram helped, not by force but by presence, placing his body where movement should stop, easing it where it should flow. Elias watched the dog work and saw the same principle at play, guidance over resistance. The next storm came without warning, a brief but violent burst that struck in the afternoon. Elias was ready this time, not with a solution, but with attention. He positioned himself upwind of the flock, using his own body as a shield, Bram flanking him. They moved the sheep not toward the barn immediately, but toward a low rise where the land dipped and the wind skimmed overhead. The sheep huddled there, confused but calmer than Elias had seen them before. When the gusts passed, he guided them home. No losses that day. That small success did not feel like victory. It felt like confirmation. Late that week, Elias received an unexpected visitor. A woman rode up on a roan mare with a white blaze and a steady, ground-covering walk. She dismounted with practiced ease and tied the horse at the fence before calling out. Elias recognized her before he saw her face. Sarah Calder was in her early 30s, tall and spare, with shoulders that suggested work rather than display. Her hair was the color of dark honey, usually pinned up beneath a plain hat, though a few strands always escaped to frame her face. Her skin was sun-browned and weathered lightly around the eyes, which were a clear gray that missed little. She dressed for utility, wool coat, riding skirt, sturdy boots, and carried herself with a directness that some men found unsettling. Widowed 3 years earlier when her husband fell from a horse and never stood again, Sarah had learned to manage her small holding alone. Loss had not made her bitter, but it had made her efficient. "I heard you've been losing sheep," she said by way of greeting, voice even. Elias nodded. "I've been learning why." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "That's not the same thing." "No," Elias agreed, "but it's related." She glanced out over the pasture, taking in the fence lines, the barn, the lay of the land. "Boone says you think it's the wind." "It is," Elias said, "or fear carried by it." Sarah considered that, then smiled faintly. "Sheep don't like surprises." "Neither do I." She stayed for a while, walking the land with him, listening as he pointed out where snow piled and where it scoured clean. She asked practical questions about cost, about time, about whether sheep would use a shelter that wasn't a barn. Elias answered honestly when he could and admitted when he couldn't. Before she left, she rested a hand on the fence and looked back at the wagons in the distance. "Whatever you're thinking," she said, "don't make it fancy. Fancy breaks first." That night, Elias sat at the kitchen table with the notebook open and a stub of pencil in hand. He sketched shapes instead of plans, curves, not lines, layers, not walls. He thought of wagons and snowdrifts, of Bram's body blocking and redirecting, of Pike's words about breaking force rather than meeting it head on. He thought of Boone's losses and Sarah's steadiness, of sheep that trusted patterns and men who clung to them. By dawn, he had not drawn a blueprint, but he had committed to a direction. The next morning, Elias hitched his horse and rode out to the far field where last summer's hay lay stacked in round bales, weathered but sound. He dismounted and walked amongst them, running a hand over the rough fiber surface. Hay was heavy. Hay absorbed sound. Hay did not argue with pressure. It accepted it and held. He imagined it arranged not as feed, but as form, curving, layered, with gaps filled and angles softened. He imagined a place where the wind would arrive angry and leave confused. Bram watched him from the fence, head tilted, tail still. Elias looked back at the dog and felt the first spark of something like certainty, not confidence, but permission. "Not yet," Elias said aloud, as if to keep the idea from running ahead of him. "Soon." He spent the rest of the day measuring distances with his steps, noting where the ground fell and rose, where water pooled in spring and froze in winter. He marked a rough circle in the snow with his boot heel, then another inside it. The shapes felt right. They felt patient. As the sun dipped and the cold returned, Elias stood in the middle of the marked ground and turned slowly, imagining walls that were not walls, and a shelter that did not demand obedience, only proximity. He imagined sheep standing together without panic, the wind lifting over them and going on its way. Behind him, the barn creaked as a gust hit it square. Elias didn't turn. He had already seen enough to know that the answer would not be found there. He walked back toward the house as the light faded, Bram at his side, the notebook tucked under his arm. Winter would come again, harder and longer. Elias did not pretend otherwise, but he no longer felt like a man waiting to be corrected. He felt like a man who had finally learned how to ask the land a better question. The idea, once named, refused to stay quiet. It followed Elias Crowley through the remainder of January like a second shadow, longer than the first and harder to ignore. He did not rush to act. Years of working land had taught him that haste was how men wasted strength. Instead, he let the idea sit beside him as he worked, turning it over the way a carpenter fingers a piece of wood, feeling for grain and weakness before the first cut. Red Mesa endured another stretch of unsettled weather. Not the grand, punishing storms men remembered for years, but smaller violences, sudden gusts that came snarling out of clear skies, cold snaps that arrived without ceremony, nights when the temperature dropped fast enough to steal breath. Elias lost no sheep during that span, but only because he stayed close, waking at odd hours, moving the flock before panic could bloom. It was not a sustainable way to live. He knew that as clearly as he knew his own name. One afternoon, with the sun low and homicide pale, Elias rode out to the hayfield again. His horse, a chestnut gelding named Rafe, moved with the patient confidence of an animal that had learned the land alongside its rider. Rafe was 12 years old, compact and strong through the chest, with a calm eye and a scar along his left shoulder from an old barbed wire tangle. He did not spook easily. and he did not argue unless pressed unfairly. Elias valued him for that. They understood each other in the quiet way that came from shared miles. The hay bales sat where they had since autumn, round and dense, their outer layers weathered gray by sun and frost. Elias dismounted and walked among them, boots crunching lightly. He pressed his shoulder against one and felt its resistance. Hay did not flex like wood. It absorbed force, swallowed it. He imagined a line of these bales set not straight but curved, each one leaning into the next, distributing pressure instead of inviting it. He imagined gaps filled, weight layered, the whole thing tied together by its own mass. Bram ranged nearby, nose low, checking scents that mattered only to him. When a gust cut across the field, the dog angled his body instinctively, turning his flank into the wind. Elias watched that movement and smiled despite himself. Even animals that did not think in words understood how to meet force sideways. He began to measure in earnest, not with tools, those would come later, but with steps and sightlines. He paced out a circle where the ground rose just enough to shed water, but dipped enough to sit below the worst of the wind. He marked the spot with a stake and a scrap of red cloth. From there, he paced again, widening the circle until it felt generous without being wasteful. Sheep needed room to move, but not so much that they scattered. He marked an opening on the east side, angled away from the prevailing winds, wide enough for the flock to pass without crowding. That night, Elias laid his notebook open on the table and drew the shape again, refining it. He added notes about height. Too low and wind would spill over and down, too high and the structure would become a sail. He thought about snow load, about how weight might settle and compress rather than collapse. He thought about cost, not in dollars, but in hay. How much he could spare without starving the flock come spring. When he finished, he sat back and stared at the page. The drawing was crude, all curves and arrows, but it felt honest. It did not pretend to be permanent. It did not demand perfection. It asked only to be built with care. The next morning, Elias rode into town to see Jonah Pike again. He found the blacksmith shaping a hinge at the anvil, sweat darkening his collar despite the cold. Elias waited until the hammering paused. "I'm going to stack hay," Elias said, without preamble. "In a curve, maybe a full circle." Pike blinked once, then barked a laugh that startled a sparrow from the rafters. "That's a new one. It's dense," Elias went on. "It blocks sound. It absorbs wind. I can spare some." Pike leaned on the anvil, studying Elias with renewed interest. "And when it rains, it gets heavier. And when snow piles up, it piles where I want it to," Elias said. "On the outside." Pike rubbed his beard thoughtfully. "You'll need something up top. Even a low roof will keep the wind from dropping straight down inside." Elias nodded. "I've been thinking that." Pike gestured toward a stack of scrap timber by the wall. "I've got old boards and bent iron you can have cheap. Not pretty, but they'll hold." "Pretty isn't the goal," Elias said. "No," Pike agreed. "Survival is." Word travels faster than a man expects in a place as small as Red Mesa. By the time Elias returned home with a wagon load of scavenged boards, he found Sarah Calder waiting by the fence. She stood with her arms folded against the cold, her roan mare tied. Nearby, steam lifting from its nostrils. She watched Elias unload without comment, her gaze sharp and curious. "So," she said when he finished, "it's hay." "Yes." "With a roof," she added, nodding toward the boards. "Low," Elias said, "angled." Sarah walked the marked circle with him, boots leaving clean prints in the frost. She crouched, scooped a handful of snow, and let it sift through her fingers. "You'll want to keep the ground from turning to mud," she said. "Straw, maybe, something that drains." "I'll lay a base," Elias said, "and rake it often." She straightened and studied him. "People are going to talk." "They already do." Sarah's mouth curved into a brief approving smile. "Good. It means they're watching." Construction began the next day. Elias worked with the deliberate patience that had become his habit. He rolled the first bale into position with the help of Rafe and a length of chain, setting it just inside the marked line. He placed the second bale against it at a slight angle, then the third, each one leaning into the curve. Bram watched from a distance, occasionally rising to chase off a curious ewe. The sheep eyed the growing structure warily, but did not bolt. Elias took that as a good sign. The work was heavy and slow. Hay dust coated his coat and beard, clung to sweat, worked its way into cuffs and collar. By the end of the first day, he had completed only a quarter of the circle, but when he stepped inside it, he felt the difference immediately. The wind still roared above, but at ground level it softened, confused by the interruption. Elias stood there, eyes closed, and let himself believe, just a little. Harlan Boone rode by that afternoon and reined in his horse, staring. He dismounted and walked closer, boots crunching on frozen ground. "You're serious," Boone said. "Yes." Boone prodded a bale with his boot. "Sheep'll eat it." "Some," Elias agreed. "I'll replace what they take." "And when it rots?" "It feeds the ground," Elias said. Boone shook his head slowly. "Your mother would have had opinions." Elias met his gaze. "She taught me not to be careless." Boone said nothing to that. He stood for a moment longer, then mounted and rode off, glancing back once before the rise hid him from view. By the end of the week, the circle was complete. Elias stacked additional bales where the wind hit hardest, building height in uneven layers that broke clean lines. He set posts at intervals and lashed boards across them to form a low, slanted roof that sloped away from the west. Over that, he spread loose hay and weighed it down with poles. It was not elegant, it was solid. The first test came sooner than Elias expected. A cold front slid in on a hard wind just before dusk, bringing sleet and a sudden drop in temperature. Elias wasted no time. He opened the angled entrance and used his body and said, Bram's presence to guide the flock inside. The sheep hesitated, then flowed in, their hooves thudding softly on the straw-covered ground. Once inside, they milled briefly, then settled, drawn together by instinct and the sudden absence of noise. Elias stayed with them as the storm hit. Sleet rattled against the outer bales and skidded up the roof, the sound dulled and distant. Wind roared overhead, but inside the circle it became a low, frustrated murmur. Elias checked each animal by lantern light, hand on wool, feeling warmth where before there had been panic. When the storm passed, Elias counted. The number held. He did not celebrate. He only exhaled. As night deepened, he sat on an overturned bucket inside the shelter. Bram curled at his feet and listened to the wind fail to find its way in. Outside, winter prowled, denied entry for the first time. Inside, the sheep breathed, steady and alive. Elias knew one night proved nothing permanent. Winter was patient, but as he watched the flock settle into the shape of safety, he felt the promise he'd made beside Maribel shift within him, not lighter, but steadier, like a load finely balanced. This, he thought, was how it began. The shelter did not announce itself as a triumph. It stood where Elias Crowley had built it, low, rounded, imperfect, like a thing grown rather than made. Hay dulled its edges. Boards leaned into one another with the cooperation of survivors. From a distance, it looked almost temporary, as if it might sink back into the land come spring and leave no argument behind. Elias liked that about it. Anything that pretended to permanence invited the wind to prove it wrong. 2 days passed without incident. Then 3. Elias used the shelter sparingly, not wanting the sheep to grow restless inside it without cause. He let them graze when the weather allowed and guided them back only when the air sharpened and the sound of it changed. He learned that sound mattered more than sight. Wind announced itself before it arrived, a thin scream that slid along fence lines and under doors. Elias heard it now the way sailors heard weather in rigging. On the 4th day, the sky turned the color of old, pewter by mid-morning. The barometer dropped fast enough to be felt in the bones. Elias was splitting wood behind the house when Bram rose from his spot near the fence and faced west, body angled, ears flat. Rafe shifted in his paddock, stamping once, nostrils flaring. Elias stopped working and listened. The wind was still distant, but it carried weight. He didn't wait. He moved the flock early, using calm rather than urgency. Bram guided from the flank, steady and silent, keeping the sheep together with small corrections. Elias opened the shelter's angled entrance and stood aside, letting the curve of the walls do the work. The sheep hesitated, then entered in a flowing line, hooves whispering on straw. Elias counted as the last one crossed the threshold. The number was right. By noon, the storm arrived in earnest. It was not snow at first, but sleet driven nearly horizontal, rattling against the hay and skidding up the roof. Wind hit the shelter and slid, confused, lifting and dispersing instead of slamming straight down. Elias stayed inside with the flock, lantern hung low, its light trembling against wool and wood. The sheep clustered, bodies pressed together, breaths rising and falling in a shared rhythm. There was movement, but no panic. As the hours wore on, the storm deepened. Snow replaced sleet, thick and relentless. Elias felt the temperature drop in increments, felt the cold test the seams of his coat and find none. Inside the shelter, the air held. Not warm, winter did not grant warmth, but survivable. Elias checked the roof twice, pushing against boards to feel their give. Snow accumulated outside, building a natural berm against the windward side. The shelter, as he'd hoped, grew stronger under pressure. By dusk, visibility dropped to nothing. The world beyond the hay walls ceased to exist. Elias sat with his back to the curve and his boots braced, lantern dimmed to conserve oil. Bram curled close, chin on paws, eyes open. The dog did not mow. Sleep. He never slept through storms anymore. Sometime after midnight, Elias heard a sound that made him rise. Footsteps, muffled by snow, approaching cautiously. He moved to the entrance and peered out. A shape emerged, hunched against the wind, leading a horse by the reins. Elias raised the lantern. Harlan Boone stood there, snow clinging to his beard and hat, his shoulders bowed under the weather. His horse, a tall, rangy sorrel with a white sock, stood with its head low, steam rising from its flanks. "I couldn't see," Boone shouted over the wind. "Lost the fence. Thought I'd head for your lights." Elias waved him in without hesitation. Boone led the horse around the curve and tied it to a post Elias had set just inside the shelter for such a possibility. The animal settled quickly, grateful for the break from the wind. Boone shook snow from his coat and looked around, eyes adjusting. The sheep watched him with mild curiosity, then returned to their huddle. Boone's expression shifted, something tight in his jaw loosening. "They're calm," he said, more to himself than to Elias. "They don't hear the wind," Elias replied. Boone took his hat off and ran a hand through his thinning gray hair. In the lantern light, he looked older than Elias remembered, the lines around his eyes deeper, his posture more tired than stubborn. "I lost 2 already," he said quietly. "Ewes, panicked near the wash." Elias nodded once. He didn't offer sympathy as a performance. He offered it as presence. Boone stayed the night. They spoke little, conserving words the way they conserved heat. At one point, Boone crouched and pressed his palm into the straw-covered ground, then rested it against a ewe's side, feeling the warmth there. He closed his eyes briefly, a gesture so small Elias might have missed it if he hadn't been watching. By morning, the storm had spent itself. Snow lay deep and sculpted, drifts piled high against the shelter's western curve. Elias stepped outside first, boots sinking nearly to his knees. He circled the structure, checking for damage. The hay held. The roof sagged slightly under the weight, but didn't fail. He counted sheep again, all present. Boone stood beside him, silent, studying the drifts. "It worked," he said finally. "Yes," Elias said. He didn't say more. Word of that night traveled fast. By afternoon, a pair of riders appeared on the road. Calder and his son Eli, a boy of about 15 with his father's dark hair and his mother's cautious eyes. They dismounted near the fence, stamping warmth back into their feet. Calder was broad and quiet, his beard trimmed close, his manner reserved. He had lost 3 sheep in the storm and wore the loss heavily. "You mind if we look?" Calder asked. Elias led them around the shelter, explaining without embellishment. Eli listened closely, asking sharp questions about angles and spacing. His curiosity was quick, unburdened by habit. Elias found himself answering more than he had intended. Later came another neighbor, then another. Some shook their heads and left unconvinced. Others lingered, walking the perimeter twice, touching hay, pressing boards. Sarah Calder arrived before sunset, her roan mare stepping carefully through the drifts. She took in the scene, the intact shelter, the sheep grazing near its entrance, Boone standing with Elias, and nodded once. "Looks like winter blinked," she said. "Only once," Elias replied. That night, after the visitors had gone and the flock settled back into routine, Elias returned to the shelter alone. He ran a hand along the hay, feeling the places where snow had compressed it tighter. He noted where the roof needed reinforcement, where drainage could be improved. Success did not dull his eye, it sharpened it. He thought of Maribel then, not with the raw ache of the first loss, but with a steadier sadness that carried purpose. The promise he'd made beside her had not been foolish after all. It had been incomplete. Behind him, Bram approached and sat, leaning lightly against Elias's leg. The dog's muzzle was grayer now, his movements slower, but his attention never wavered. Elias rested a hand on Bram's head and looked out across the land, reshaped by storm and survival. The shelter stood between him and the open field, quiet and unassuming. It did not challenge winter, it endured it. And for the first time since the season had turned, Elias allowed himself a measured hope. Not that winter would spare him, but that he had finally learned how to ask it to pass by. The storm left Red Mesa changed, though not in any way a man could measure with tools. Snow receded slowly, revealing fence lines bent but standing, roofs scarred but intact. What lingered was something quieter, a shift in how people looked at the land and at one another. Winter had not been beaten, it never was, but it had been answered, and answers had a way of moving faster than doubt. Elias Crowley felt that movement almost immediately. He didn't seek it. In fact, he tried to keep his days small and predictable after the storm, returning to routine as if nothing remarkable had happened. He let the sheep graze when the weather softened, guided them back to the shelter when the wind sharpened, and spent the rest of his hours repairing what the storm had strained. The roof needed reinforcing at 2 points where snow had settled unevenly. The entrance angle could be improved to reduce swirl when gusts came from the south. These were adjustments, not rethinking. Elias welcomed them. Improvement felt honest. Pride did not. Bram followed him everywhere, moving more slowly now, joints stiff in the mornings. The dog was 9 this winter, his muzzle nearly white, his eyes still sharp but rimmed with age. Elias had begun to notice how Bram paused before lying down, how he chose warmth more deliberately. It worried him in the way all quiet changes worried him, but he did not name the worry aloud. Naming things, he had learned, gave them weight. On the 3rd day after the storm, Jonah Pike rode out unannounced. He came on a heavy draft mare with feathered legs and a patient disposition, the kind of horse that did not hurry even when asked. Pike dismounted slowly, his knees creaking, and took his time looking around before speaking. He wore his usual leather apron, darkened by years of work, and his beard was bound loosely with a strip of cloth to keep sparks from catching. "So this is it," Pike said, nodding toward the shelter. "This is it," Elias replied. Pike walked the perimeter with the same attention he gave a new piece of iron, fingers brushing hay, eyes following lines and angles. He stopped at the windward side where snow had compacted into a hard, protective wall. "You let the storm finish the job," Pike said. Elias shrugged. "I let it help." Pike smiled, slow and genuine. "That's good thinking." He straightened and met Elias's gaze. "Boone's talking." That did not surprise Elias. What surprised him was the tone Pike used, less amusement, more respect. "Talking to who?" Elias asked. "Anyone who'll listen," Pike said, "mostly about how he should have listened sooner." Elias absorbed that without comment. Boone's change mattered less than the pattern it suggested. By the end of the week, people began arriving with questions rather than opinions. They came alone or in pairs, riding up, tying their horses, standing with hands tucked into coat sleeves as they looked at the shelter. Elias answered what he could. He did not exaggerate or simplify. When he did not know something, he said so. That honesty, more than the shelter itself, seemed to hold their attention. One of the first to come was Margaret Hale. She arrived in a buggy rather than on horseback, the wheels crunching softly over frozen ground. Margaret was in her late 20s, small-framed but upright, with dark hair pinned neatly beneath a plain hat. Her coat was practical but well-kept, and she wore gloves even when the sun was out. Her eyes were dark and quick, missing nothing. She introduced herself with a firm handshake and a voice that carried confidence without force. "I write for the County Bulletin," she said, "mostly market prices and notices, but people are talking about what you've built." Elias glanced at the shelter, then back at her. "They're welcome to look." Margaret smiled. "I'd like to understand." She walked with him, notebook in hand, asking precise questions. How many bales? What diameter? How did the sheep respond the first time? What failed, and how was it corrected? Elias answered patiently, surprised to find he enjoyed the clarity of her attention. She was not there to be impressed. She was there to be accurate. "This isn't a barn," she said finally, "and it's not a pen." "No," Elias agreed. "It's a place to stand together." Margaret wrote that down. That afternoon, Sarah Calder returned, this time with her sleeves rolled up and a length of twine looped over her shoulder. She had decided to build one of her own and had come, she said, to watch Elias work before committing her hay. They spent the day reinforcing the roof together, passing boards, adjusting angles. Sarah worked with efficient movements, wasting nothing, her face set in concentration. When they paused to rest, she leaned on her knees and looked out over the pasture. "People are afraid to look foolish," she said. "They'd rather lose animals than be laughed at." Elias wiped his hands on his coat. "Foolish is relative." Sarah nodded. "Dead is absolute." Not everyone came in good faith. Late one morning, a man Elias did not recognize rode up hard, his horse lathered despite the cold. He dismounted abruptly and strode toward the shelter, boots striking frozen ground with unnecessary force. He was tall and raw-boned, with a sharp nose and a beard trimmed to a narrow point. His coat was fine wool, better than most in Red Mesa, and his gloves were new. His eyes were pale and restless. "Name's Victor Lane," he said. "I've got land east of the river." Elias nodded. "What can I do for you?" Lane circled the shelter once, twice, without touching it. "Heard you found a way to cheat Winter." "I wouldn't call it cheating," Lane snorted. "Call it what you want. My sheep died anyway." He stopped in front of Elias, close enough to crowd. "I don't see why yours should live when mine don't." The accusation hung there, sharp and unfair. Elias felt Bram step closer to his leg, not aggressive, just present. "I didn't take anything from you," Elias said evenly. "I only changed what I could control." Lane's jaw worked. "You think you're better than the rest of us?" Elias shook his head. "I think I'm tired of burying sheep." For a moment, Elias thought Lane might push the issue further. Instead, the man looked away, shoulders sagging just a fraction. "Show me," he muttered. They walked the shelter together. Elias explained the reasoning again, slower this time, choosing words with care. Lane listened, his posture gradually losing its edge. When they finished, he nodded stiffly and left without thanks. Elias did not take offense. Some men needed time to let grief settle before it could turn into anything useful. As winter dragged on, the shelter became part of Elias's daily rhythm. He learned how long sheep could remain inside before restlessness crept in, how to rake straw to keep footing dry, how to adjust the entrance when wind patterns shifted. He kept notes, refining measurements, sketching improvements. The shelter was no longer an experiment. It was a practice. Harlan Boone returned often, sometimes alone, sometimes with others in tow. He asked questions now, direct and practical. One afternoon, as they stood watching the flock graze near the shelter's entrance, Boone spoke without looking at Elias. "My wife hated winter," he said. "Said it took things without asking." He cleared his throat. "I told her that was just how it was." Elias waited. Boone shifted his weight. "Maybe I used that excuse too often." The admission was quiet, but it mattered. By late February, something undeniable had taken shape. Farms that had built shelters, or were in the process of building them, reported fewer losses. Not none. Winter still demanded payment, but the quantities. Numbers changed. The difference could be counted, and counting, Elias knew, was the language farmers trusted. One evening, as the sun dipped and painted the snow with pale gold, Elias stood at the shelter entrance and watched the sheep file in on their own as the wind rose. They didn't wait for his signal. They had learned that sight moved him more than any praise or curiosity. Learning meant survival could outlast the man who taught it. Bram settled beside him, breathing slow and steady. Rafe grazed nearby, head low, unconcerned. The land, for once, felt almost generous. Elias knew the shelter would not be the end of the story. Already people were asking him to help plan their own. Already the idea was slipping from his hands into the wider world. That was as it should be. Solutions that stayed owned by one man were not solutions at all. He closed the gate gently and rested his hand on the rough wood. Winter still had weeks to run. There would be more storms, more tests, but the shape of the fight had changed. For the first time, Elias understood that proof did not arrive all at once. It arrived the way snow did, quietly, steadily, until the land itself looked different. By March, winter in Red Mesa had grown mean in a different way. It no longer announced itself with spectacle. Instead, it lingered. Cold mornings followed by deceptively mild afternoons, then sudden drops that caught the unwary and punished routine. This was the season that killed by exhaustion rather than surprise. Men grew tired, animals grew thin, attention slipped at the edges. Elias Crowley felt that fatigue settle into his own bones. The work had multiplied quietly. Where once he had only his own flock to think about, now there were questions carried to his fence on horseback and on foot. He did not turn people away, but he did not invite them either. He helped when asked, measured words carefully, and tried to keep his own land from suffering for his generosity. The shelter still stood firm. Its shape had softened slightly as the outer layers of hay compacted, settling into a denser, more unified mass. Elias had added drainage trenches around the perimeter, shallow but effective, guiding meltwater away before it could pool and refreeze. Inside, the ground stayed dry enough to keep hooves steady. The sheep moved in and out with a confidence that bordered on habit. They no longer needed Bram's guidance unless the wind rose sharply. Elias counted them less obsessively now, not because he cared less, but because he trusted more. Trust, however, was not something Winter respected. The storm arrived on a night when Elias almost ignored the signs. The day had been calm, the sky a washed-out blue, the sun offering a fragile warmth that melted the top layer of snow. By dusk, the air cooled but did not threaten. Elias finished his chores and sat down to eat, boots still on, fatigue heavy behind his eyes. Bram lay near the stove, breathing slow. Rafe shifted once in the paddock and settled, then the wind changed. It did not howl. It crept. Elias felt it first as pressure in his ears, then as a low vibration through the floorboards. He stood at once. Fatigue burned away by instinct. He stepped outside and tasted the air. It was wrong. Sharp, metallic, carrying distant snow. He did not hesitate. He roused the flock quickly, using his voice low and steady. Bram was already moving, body angled, cutting off hesitation before it could become fear. The sheep flowed toward the shelter as they had learned to do, hooves striking packed ground with practiced rhythm. Elias closed the gate behind the last ewe just as the first gust slammed into the hay wall. This storm was different. The wind came in waves, not constant but hammering, testing, retreating, then striking again from a new direction. Snow followed, fine and needling, finding every weakness. Elias stayed inside, lantern hung high, eyes moving constantly. He felt the shelter shift, not collapse, but flex, hay absorbing force, boards creaking under strain. An hour in, something cracked. Not the wall, but the roof, one of the older boards Pike had warned might fail under. Uneven load. Elias heard it before he saw it, a sharp report swallowed by wind. Snow spilled through a narrow gap, dusting the straw below. The sheep stirred, unease rippling outward. Elias moved at once. He climbed the inner support, boots slipping slightly, and pressed a spare board into place, bracing it with his shoulder while Bram stood below, head lifted, eyes fixed on the flock. Elias drove a nail with gloved hands numb from cold, the sound dull and stubborn. The gap sealed. The snow stopped falling inside. He climbed down carefully, breath ragged, heart hammering. The sheep settled again, tension easing. Elias leaned against the curve of the wall and closed his eyes for a brief moment, letting the adrenaline pass. Outside, winter raged. Somewhere near midnight, a new sound reached him through the wind, bleating, sharp and panicked, carried from the dark. Elias stiffened. Bram was already on his feet, ears forward, body quivering with readiness. Someone else was in. Trouble. Elias hesitated only long enough to grab his coat and lantern. He opened the shelter gate just enough to slip through, then closed it again, trusting the flock to remain where it was safest. Bram followed at his heel. The wind hit them like a wall, stealing breath, tearing at coat and fur alike. The sound led them toward the road. They found Victor Lane half a mile from Elias's land, struggling near a collapsed fence where snow had drifted high and hard. His sheep were scattered, silhouettes breaking and reforming in the white chaos. Lane himself looked smaller than Elias remembered, his fine coat no match for the storm, his movements frantic and inefficient. Elias did not waste words. He moved to block the windward side, placing himself where the gusts struck hardest, using his body to slow their force. Bram darted forward, snapping the air, turning sheep back toward the lee Elias created. It was brutal work. The cold burned. The wind stole balance. Twice Elias nearly fell. Lane shouted something. Gratitude, apology, Elias never knew. His voice vanished into the storm. Together, inch by inch, they pushed the sheep toward Elias's shelter. It took nearly an hour. By the time the last ewe stumbled inside, Elias's hands were shaking uncontrollably, his fingers numb and useless. Bram limped slightly, favoring his right foreleg, but did not slow. Inside the shelter, chaos gave way to relief. The sheep crowded in, bodies pressing close, warmth building quickly. Lane stood just inside the entrance, chest heaving, snow caked into his beard and hair. Up close, Elias saw the exhaustion etched deep into the man's face, the brittle edge gone, replaced by something raw and frightened. "I didn't think it would hit like that," Lane said hoarsely. "I waited too long." Elias nodded once. "Most of us do." Lane looked around at the shelter, the hay walls, the low roof, the calm animals. His eyes filled, though no tears fell. "You could have left us," he said. Elias shrugged, a small, tired movement. "I didn't." The storm raged until morning. When dawn finally bled into the sky, the land looked stripped and reshaped. Drifts swallowed fences. The road disappeared entirely. Elias stepped outside to assess the damage, moving slowly, every muscle aching. The shelter stood, scarred, compressed, but standing. He counted sheep, his own and Lane's together, all alive. Lane helped Elias dig a path back toward the road once the wind eased. They worked in silence, breath steaming, shovels biting into packed snow. When they finished, Lane stood awkwardly, hands hanging at his sides. "I was wrong," he said finally. "About you, about this." He gestured back toward the shelter. "I don't say that easily." "I know," Elias replied. Lane nodded, mounted his horse, and rode away slower than he had come. The aftermath of that storm reached farther than the last. Losses elsewhere were severe. Word spread that Elias's shelter had not only saved his flock, but another man's as well. By the week's end, 3 farmers had begun clearing ground for shelters of their own. Elias helped where he could, measuring, advising, lifting when needed. But he set limits. He could not save everyone by himself. Sarah Calder began her build that same week. Elias rode over to help her set the first bales. They worked side by side, conversations sparse but comfortable. Sarah's shelter took shape faster than his had, benefiting from his mistakes and corrections. "Funny," she said at one point, pausing to wipe her brow. "People think courage looks loud." Elias set another bale into place. "Mostly it looks tired." She smiled at that. Bram's limp worsened over the next days. Elias noticed the way the dog lagged behind, the stiffness that did not ease with warmth. One evening, as they sat by the stove, Bram struggled to his feet and whined softly, a sound Elias had not heard from him in years. The sight cut deeper than any winter loss. Elias knelt and ran his hands over Bram's leg, feeling swelling beneath fur. Age and strain had taken their due. Elias pressed his forehead briefly to the dog's grizzled head, breathing in the familiar scent of hay and smoke. "You did enough," he murmured. Bram's tail thumped once, weak but insistent. By the end of March, winter began its slow retreat. Snow softened, water ran. The shelter weathered its first season without claiming a single sheep under Elias's care. Others were not so fortunate, but fewer died where shelters stood. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the wind at last fell silent, Elias stood at the shelter entrance with Bram resting at his feet. Sheep grazed nearby, unafraid. The land looked altered, not conquered, but answered. Elias knew the winter had taken things from him, sleep, ease, and the illusion that careful men were spared. But it had not taken everything. It had left behind knowledge, community, and the quiet certainty that some losses were no longer inevitable. That, Elias thought, was enough to carry forward. Spring did not arrive in Red Mesa all at once. It came in fragments, tentative and easily reversed, as if the land itself was uncertain whether winter had truly loosened its grip. Snow lingered in the shadows of fences and along the north-facing slopes, while the low ground softened into mud that clung to boots and hooves alike. The wind still moved across the valley, but it no longer carried the same authority. It passed through now like a messenger who had delivered his warning and found no one left to threaten. Elias Crowley woke one morning to the sound of water dripping steadily from the eaves. He lay still for a moment, listening, measuring the rhythm. It was not rain. It was melt. That distinction mattered. He swung his legs from the bed and pulled on his boots, joints stiff but spirit light in a way he had not felt since autumn. Outside, the air smelled different: damp earth, old hay, the faint promise of green beneath rot. Bram struggled to his feet beside the stove, slower now, favoring his right leg more noticeably. He was nearly 10, Elias reckoned, and winter had taken its toll. The dog's once black coat was mottled with gray, and his eyes had softened, less sharp at the edges. But they still followed Elias everywhere, still asked the same question they always had: what next? "Easy," Elias murmured, resting a hand on Bram's back as they stepped outside together. The shelter stood unchanged, its hay walls compressed and darkened from weeks of weather, its roof patched where Elias had reinforced it after the last storm. It no longer looked like a strange intrusion on the land. It looked settled, as if it had always been meant to be there. Sheep grazed nearby, spreading out with cautious confidence, lifting their heads only when the wind shifted suddenly. Elias counted them out of habit. The number held. That simple fact still surprised him. The weeks that followed were busy in a quieter way than winter had been. Where once there had been urgency and reaction, now there was planning. Elias rode out often, sometimes alone, sometimes with others. He helped Sarah Calder finish her shelter, adjusting the entrance angle after a few days of observation. He rode east of the river to Victor Lane's place and walked the land with him, pointing out where wind funneled and where snow piled. Lane listened closely now, his earlier sharpness dulled by gratitude and the lingering ache of near loss. He was a different man than the one who had stormed into Elias's yard weeks before, still proud, but no longer closed. Harlan Boone began his own shelter in earnest, enlisting his nephews and any neighbor who would lend a hand. Elias stopped by once, uninvited, and helped set the first bales. Boone said little, but when they finished for the day, he clapped Elias on the shoulder with a hand heavy and sincere. "I buried fewer this year," Boone said. "That matters." It did. Not everyone followed. A few men clung to old ways, muttering about luck and mild seasons. Elias did not argue with them. He had learned that proof did not require defense. It required time. Margaret Hale returned twice more before spring settled fully, her notebook thicker with each visit. She interviewed Sarah, Boone, even Victor Lane, collecting their words with care. She asked Elias fewer questions now, focusing instead on the wider effect. One afternoon, as they stood watching the sheep move calmly in and out of the shelter, she closed her notebook and looked at him. "You realize this won't stay here," she said. Elias raised an eyebrow. "The shelter?" "The idea," Margaret corrected. "People beyond Red Mesa will read this." Elias considered that, gaze drifting to the horizon. "That's fine. You don't want credit?" "I want fewer graves in spring," he said simply. Margaret studied him for a moment, then nodded. "That's what I'll write." The bulletin came out in late April. Elias did not see it at first. He heard about it when a man rode up from a neighboring valley, dust-coated and curious, asking to see the hay windbreaks. Others followed. Some came with genuine interest, others with skepticism thinly veiled as courtesy. Elias showed them what he could, explained what he knew, and sent them home to decide for themselves. He did not travel much beyond Red Mesa. His work was here. As the days lengthened, Bram's condition worsened. The limp became a slow, careful gait. He slept more, waking only when Elias moved or the sheep shifted suddenly. One evening, as Elias repaired a fence near the shelter, Bram lay in the shade and did not rise when called. Elias felt a tightness in his chest that had nothing to do with weather. He knelt beside the dog and checked the leg again, hands gentle, movements practiced. The swelling had increased. Age, strain, and cold had combined into something that did not yield to rest. Elias sat there for a long time, the tatisa, sound of sheep cropping grass filling the space between thoughts. He knew this kind of ending. He had seen it in animals and men alike. It did not announce itself loudly. It waited for acknowledgement. That night, Elias slept lightly, waking often to check on Bram. The dog breathed steadily, eyes opening briefly each time Elias shifted, then closing again. At dawn, Elias carried Bram outside and settled him near the shelter entrance, where the ground was dry and the breeze mild. The sheep passed close, some brushing Bram's fur with their flanks as they moved. Bram watched them with quiet satisfaction. By midday, Sarah arrived, having noticed Bram's absence from his usual patrols. She knelt beside Elias without speaking, resting a hand on Bram's shoulder. "He's had a good run," she said softly. "Yes," Elias replied. Bram did not suffer long. He passed as the sun dipped toward the west, head resting against Elias's knee, breath easing away like a tide that had reached its limit. Elias buried him near the shelter, beneath a juniper that had broken the wind long before hay ever did. He marked the place with a simple stone and no words. The land did not need them. Loss, Elias knew, did not invalidate what had been saved. It simply reminded him that saving did not mean keeping forever. Summer came on gently after that. The sheep grew heavier. Lambs stumbled through the pasture, awkward and curious. The shelter remained, used less often now, but still standing, still ready. Elias did not dismantle it. He believed in preparedness more than tidiness. One evening, as the heat bled out of the day and shadows lengthened, Elias stood with Sarah near the fence line, watching the flock settle. "You changed something here," she said, not accusing, not praising, just stating fact. Elias shook his head. "The land did. I listened." Sarah smiled. "Most people don't." They stood in companionable silence. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called, its voice thin and lonely. The sheep did not startle. They had learned which sounds mattered. As the year turned, Elias found his days full but not heavy. He still worked hard. He still worried. But the constant dread that winter had once carried was gone. In its place was something quieter and more durable, understanding. He knew winter would return. He knew storms would test what he had built. He also knew that when the wind came, the sheep would have a place to stand together, and the land would offer its cooperation instead of its indifference. That knowledge was not heroic. It was practical. It was earned. On the first cool night of autumn, nearly a year after Maribel had been found frozen in the wash, Elias walked the perimeter of the shelter one last time before dark. He checked the roof, the walls, the entrance. Everything held. He stood in the center and turned slowly, feeling the shape of it around him. The wind stirred beyond the hay, lifting dust and memory alike, then passed on. Elias rested his hand against the wall and closed his eyes. What remained after the wind, he thought, was not victory. It was care, given form. It was the quiet proof that some losses did not have to be repeated. That was enough. Sometimes, miracles don't arrive with thunder or blazing light. Sometimes, they come quietly, in the shape of a man who refuses to give up, in walls built from ordinary hay, in hands that choose care over habit. Elias didn't stop the wind. Only God commands the wind. But God gave Elias something else, eyes to see what others ignored, a heart unwilling to accept needless loss, and the courage to act when everyone said, "This is just how it is." And that is how many miracles begin. Not by changing the whole world at once, but by changing one small corner of it, one flock, one life, one night spared from fear. In our own lives, we face storms too, not always of snow and wind, but of loneliness, grief, exhaustion, and doubt. And maybe God is not asking us to stop the storm, but to build shelter within it, for ourselves, for someone weaker, for someone forgotten. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to share it with someone who may be walking through a storm. Right now, tell us in the comments where you are watching from, so we can pray together across distance and time. And if you believe that no child, no animal, and no soul should ever face fear alone, please subscribe to this channel. We pray that God blesses you, keeps you safe through every season, and grants you the strength to be someone's quiet miracle. Amen.